Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to the Looking Forward to the Past lecture series. This is the last one we'll have till next year, and we are really closing out with a fantastic program. But first, a special thank you to the First Bank of Alabama, and please convey your thanks to those people whenever you have an opportunity to talk to them. Or you can write a letter and give it to Chris as he goes out the door. Chris, thank you all very much. I think we're going to have one of the most exciting programs that we've been a part of for some time. Alex Colvin was here a few years ago, and she just did a beautiful job on the women's suffrage movement in this country. And since that time, she's been very busy. You know, she finished her doctorate at Auburn in Indian Studies. She got married. She has 2 children, and she has one of the best jobs in the state working for archives and history. And I think that when you look at, she's in charge of exhibits and publications, and she's a program coordinator. I don't know what the rest of that crowd does, but she apparently does all the work, and there's nothing left for them to do. But she has just an incredible background. So, you know, she was the alum of the year at Stanford University just recently, and finishes as a PhD at Auburn. And I don't know of anybody who knows any more about Creek Indian Society than she knows. So she did a wonderful program in the past. So she's going to tell us how Alexander McGillivray, leader of the Creek Nation, went to New York and negotiated with President George Washington. And then all the rest is history. And Alex, it's just a thrill to have you back, and we're going to turn the program over to you. Alex, give him a signal.
Thank you. Thank y'all so much. I'm so excited to be back here, and I believe I said it last time, but I just feel like I have to say it every single time, that y'all are so lucky to have this library here in Sylacauga. This is an amazing institution. It's not only beautiful, but the people are so welcoming, and every time I come here, I am just flabbergasted. I'm like, this is amazing. So just kudos to the team here and to this library, and I'm so excited to be back, and I'm so excited to tell you about, like you said, the Treaty of New York, Alexander McGillivray, George Washington, and this treaty. Now, this topic is something that I've been researching and dealing with for quite some time. It's a part of my dissertation, but it's also something that's kind of come back up recently as we're doing renovations at the archive. So the Museum of Alabama is undergoing renovations of its permanent gallery spaces. We have a brand new military gallery called Alabama Military Stories, a brand new children's gallery where the young and young at heart can go interact with different spaces, learn about history through play. And we are in the middle of redoing a brand new Native American gallery called First Peoples of Alabama. But that's not the only place that Native American history is shown in our museum. There's also a huge component of it in our cornerstone exhibit, Alabama Voices. And in that part of the gallery, we talk about Native American history from around 1700 to 1840. So right in the middle of that is this treaty. And as we were working on the treaty in this area in the gallery, I was reminded of the significance of this treaty, not just to Creek history and the Native American story, but also to US history. And it's one that we don't often talk about. If you're in a huge American history class, you don't stop really and talk about this treaty. But when looking at it, when looking at the people who are coming to the table, what their intent was, what they're looking for, it tells you a story of the early nation, of the US. As they're trying to figure out their identity, their place in the world, this treaty is a huge part of how they're going to define their relationship to Native America, how they're defining the relationship between federal and state governments, but also kind of sets into motion something that will define the Southeast, Alabama, and the future of relationships between the United States and Native Americans. Now, at the end of this, you can tell me, Alex, you oversold it. Hopefully, I will convince you that this treaty is a really big deal, and it's another way that, in some ways, this state, this area, is connected to that early national identity. Now, we weren't a state then, but people living where we are right now were a huge part in this story. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of everything, I started with this photo. Now, this photo, it kind of may look kind of, okay, it's a watch, interesting place to start, but this watch showed up on an episode of Pawn Stars in 2012. So on the History Channel. And someone brought it in because, it looks pretty important, right? If you can't tell on the bottom right there, it says G. Washington. So they were like, all right, this is something. George Washington was involved. Along the top, it says A. McGillivray. And then in the middle, Treaty, New York, 1790. A present of George Washington to Alexander McGillivray, Treaty of New York, 1790. So, then this watch, you're asking me what happened to it. This is something me and my advisor, Catherine Braun, we were like, you see it? It's exciting. Where did it go? It went into a private collection somewhere. I don't actually know where it is right now. I saw recently on Facebook, it was some event where people were going to see it, but it was in Scotland. I was like, well, I can't make it there. So somehow this watch is somewhere out there. And it looks so small, right? It looks almost nondescript. They didn't necessarily know what they had. They knew it was Washington. They knew it had to be something. But this watch is a symbol of an agreement that was made, of a promise made between two gentlemen. And it was a present to kind of confirm that promise. And that's the promise we're going to talk about today. What these two men, who you may have heard of them, hopefully, but learning what they were bringing into this agreement and how this treaty played out. Oh, is this the correct? Oh, it is, good. So, to start off, a map. Now, this map, you might have seen it before. This is the John Mitchell map, and it was first published, this is one iteration of it, but it was first published in 1755. And this is one that shows up a lot. It talks about, the claims of the colonies, right? There's 13 British colonies, and kind of the lines that are extended are the claims that they are making. And it runs off the edge of the map, right? Their claims are endless. Now, what's important to know about this map is that there's a lot of details, and we're going to come back to this map a lot. There are layers to it, to understanding why this map is so significant. So significant that I read an article that said it was the most important map of the 18th century. And that's saying something. What makes this so important and so significant? Your first impression when seeing it is, oh, it must be because of those endless claims, right? It's also important to know that it's happening at the time of the 7 Years' War, which is more often known in the United States as the French and Indian War. So this is being created in some way to kind of help with that imperial identity, right? They need to get these colonists involved in this war. It's spreading across the world. This is in many ways, a world war being fought in India, being fought in Europe. It's going to be fought here. And one of the things is, these are the claims that we want to make. And France is threatening those claims. Let's fight them, and then all this land will be opened up for settlement. You see, this land and the desire to kind of keep getting land was so important to that colonial identity, so important to the identity of the people, specifically the men living in those colonies, that there are entire professions around getting that land. Land surveying, land speculation. And arguably, one of the most famous land surveyors and land speculators, is George Washington. Now, he's not known generally because of his land surveying and land speculation. He's known for his military feats and his positions, and of course, being president of the United States of America. Bah. What we're going to talk about in this moment, though, is understanding a different side of him. So he's born to a tobacco planter, and that's going to be his profession, right? It's kind of like set in stone. Like he's going to inherit this plantation. He is going to be a tobacco planter. But there's always that awkward moment when you're old enough to start doing something, but you're not quite the head of like the family business, if you will, right? So he has this moment where he has to figure out something else to do. At the age of 17, what he decides to do is land surveying. So he actually goes on his first survey at the age of 17. And land surveying is just what you might think. You go out, you're looking at the land, you're measuring it, you're mapping it, you're dividing it up into different plots, trying to figure out, how you would divide this land for future use. Over the next, 3 or 4 years, he is credited with doing over 200 land surveys. It encompasses more than 60,000 acres. But land surveying is one thing. Land speculation is very similar, or very connected, but instead of going and surveying the land, you're buying the land. You're buying it when it's kind of undesired, unwanted, so you're buying it cheap. You're waiting until people all of a sudden want that land and the demand for it goes up, and you sell it for a profit. He buys his first piece of land on speculation at the age of 20. And throughout his life, you will see different moments that he has tens of thousands of acres that are meant to be sold when the time is right. In his will, at his death, he had over 50,000 acres in New York, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the Ohio River Valley, all of it that was not a part of the estate, but was meant to be sold and the profits given to his estate. So he is actively taking part in this. Why? Well, you got to diversify. Tobacco is a boom and bust kind of product, right? There's times where it's really profitable and times where it's not. And more, tobacco is not the profitable product that it once was. So this is a way to bring in income, to make an investment that diversifies your portfolio, if you will, to use a modern term. But it's also kind of like, a part of that colonial identity. It's the promise, right? There will be more land. Their population is growing. Eventually, you have to have somewhere to go. And where you're going to go is into these other lands, right? And this is so much a promise that in that 7 Years' War or French and Indian War, direct promises are made to land that's outside of the 13 colonies. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia said, if you join the Virginia militia, you will be able to take part in 200,000 acres in the Ohio River Valley. We'll divide it up evenly between officers, and also soldiers will get some. And everyone will get a bit of land in the Ohio River Valley if you join and fight. And so a lot of Virginians, that's one of the main reasons they joined. Sure, there could be a sense of patriotism, of what you owe this empire, but it was also a very material reason to join. Even George Washington credits that was a huge motivating factor, right? You can have both an honor in serving, becoming an officer, also payment in that sense too, but it's also this promise. You see, there is an issue with Governor Dinwiddie's promise, and it's shown on this map, but you can't see it because it's so far away, it's so small. But if we go closer to the Ohio River Valley, you see it's still really hard to read, but if you can go and look at this map, it's in the Library of Congress, you can zoom in. All of those words that you see written, those small words, are the names of Native American groups. See, this land, they can make whatever claim they want to. There are people living on this land. And already the story gets more complicated. Whose land is it? Because the colonists and land speculators see it as, well, that'll be our land. We'll speculate it. We'll get a title to it. Eventually, it'll be brought into here. The French are the only reason keeping us from this land because we have to fight a war with them. We're already in a war with them. The British Empire is hoping to get claims to this land after the war. But then you have groups of people who are, and sometimes helping the British. And they see it as being their land. It's been their land for centuries. So, after the 7 Years' War, people come, they look for the fulfillment of that promise, and it doesn't come. Because you see, the people living in this area in particular, in the Ohio River Valley, they start fighting back. So they start attacking forts. They start attacking British colonists. So redcoats don't leave the area. They stay. They're trying to quell a new war, Pontiac's War. They're trying to make agreements here and there and everywhere. And they've just ended, once again, it's in a 7-year war. They are in debt. They are tired. They don't have the manpower, the resources. So what is this British imperial government to do? Well, they're going to maybe look to their colonists to raise a few taxes to help pay for that war. Doesn't end up well. And they're also going to say, look, this can't be ours. That promise that we made, we're ending that promise now. So they make a proclamation in 1763, and there's other parts of this proclamation. It's not just about this line, but this line is arguably one of the biggest legacies of this proclamation. They draw a line down, they say, you can't go west of this line. There can be no settlements. There can be no surveying. There can be no speculation. For right this second, consider this line to be absolute. And the reason they're doing that is they don't have the ability to fight a war with every Native American nation living in this area. They're going to try a different approach. But for right now, they just need the colonists to stay on the eastern side of this line. And of course, everybody listened to them and nobody crossed this line, right? George Washington, upstanding citizen that he was, followed the law, except for he didn't. He saw this as an annoyance, and he even wrote in letters, this is just to quiet the minds and the worries of the Indians. If we don't try to speculate that land, we will be considered fools. We'll miss out on an opportunity. So he is telling everyone who he's working with, everyone who's working for him, just keep doing it. But just quietly. Act like, oh, I didn't know, right? And so you have this moment where, we have this idea like, oh, he's literally breaking the law in this moment for the potential of a payoff later, right? And he wasn't the only person. There's a lot of people. There's whole companies, the Mississippi Land Company, the Ohio Land Company, all these companies who are still doing land speculation and still causing all of these problems and issues because they want the promise, right? I told you, so much a part of their identity at this point. And I am not saying that the proclamation line is, even, I would argue, even like a major reason for the revolution, but it is a massive hindrance on people. And it is a symbol of all these other things that are happening, these stamp acts and these taxes. It feels like the British government is getting too involved. They're breaking that promise of what the purpose of coming to the colonies were. They had this kind of, they call it a benign neglect before the French and Indian War, where they were allowed to kind of do things themselves. And then all of a sudden, Great Britain seems to care a whole lot about what's going on. They try to raise taxes. They try to come in and tell us where we can and can't go, limit the movement. But what's happening behind the scenes, so that's the proclamation line, like I said, right? But what's happening behind the scenes is Britain is trying to figure out how to approach getting this land in a different way. War is not an option, so how do they do it? They try to negotiate. And even here in this is, you might not be able to tell it right here, but if you look, I don't have the laser pointer, I have to run over here real quick. But if you look, like right here, this is Mobile. So you could trace it up right around here and then come over and come down. There's Alabama, roughly right around there, right? So in this area, just like the other ones, you can see there's all these different, the Alabamus, Tallapooses, the lower creeks, upper creeks, Choctaws, so all these different groups living here. And what is Great Britain trying to do? Because this land had previously been under Spanish and French control. After the French and Indian War, East and West Florida, as they were called, become a part of the British Empire. So they spend about a decade trying to figure out what that means. So where is the line exactly? Where can we settle? Where do we officially have claims? They're meeting in Augusta. They're meeting in Pensacola. All the way up till 1771, 1772, they are meeting with Native Americans in this area, trying to figure out exactly the border. And in Pensacola, right here, you have a group of, and we call them Creek. You might also hear them called Muskogee or Alabamas. There was lots of different tribal identities, but we also call them Upper Creek, mostly because they were living right around here. They all traveled down to Pensacola to meet with the British. And there is this wonderful record that you can read through of this week-long negotiation. And this is not the first time. They've met with them for a long period of time to try to even begin discussions, but then there's almost like a week-long discussion where they're trying to finalize, where is that boundary, where is that boundary? And the Upper Creeks chose to speak for them a man named Mististiguo. He was a leader from a place called Little Tallahassee, which is near modern-day Montgomery. And he would come and represent all of these groups and speak on their behalf. And from him, we switch that perspective. That map I keep showing you with those claims and this and that and how land is going to be owned and controlled. He provides a perspective into a different way of understanding land. And I'll make sure I get his quote just right, so I'll read it to you. He said, "My nation is numerous, and every child in it has an equal property in the land with the first warrior. Making any alteration in the boundary without the consent of the whole will be improper. The land isn't something you have a deed on. It's not individual property. But it's not, sometimes people think that means, oh, they didn't have a conception of property. It is their property, but it's their collective property. Every child is equal to the first warrior, to the leader. And you have to have the consent of the whole before you can give away any of that land. So he's coming and saying, I don't care that the French gave you this at the end of the war. They were living here by our own permission. We didn't give them the land. We granted them permission to live on our land. They don't have the right to give you this land. But he recognizes they need to have a boundary because he's starting to recognize that maybe the British in particular start to get a little pushy. So he says, all right, fine, we'll make a boundary with you, but after we have settled the line, it should be like a stone wall, never to be broke. He says, fine, I want to make a boundary with you, but this is it. This is the end. We'll make a boundary here and move on. And right as they're starting to settle that boundary, this thing called the American Revolution happens. and all the players change. Now, I assume everyone knows that in the American Revolution, George Washington chooses a side, very solidly on the patriotic side. He is, in fact, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, right? So, he is very solidly against the British. That's important for you to know as we get introduced to the second person who I said I was going to tell you about today, Alexander McGillivray. Now, I wish I could have up here on the screen a wonderful portrait of Alexander McGillivray so I could show you what he looks like. But there is no known portrait of Alexander McGillivray. Now, if you look on Google, if you look him up, different pictures show up, but none of them are actually him. Most famously, there's this one, and it's actually a gentleman called Miko, who was someone else who went to the Treaty of New York. And I always feel so bad for him. I'm like, he has his own identity. Don't let him be swallowed up by the behemoth that is Alexander McGillivray. There's others that come from later. There's this one that people thought for a long time might be him, but it's actually been shown that it's from a different time period than when he was living. So it might be one of his descendants or someone who was related to him that also has the last name McGillivray. All that being said, as I thought, how can I illustrate Alexander McGillivray to you? I decided to choose a signature. Now, the reason I chose a signature is it tells you a lot. Number one, he can sign his own name. He knows how to write in English. He knows how to read in English. Something we have, we may not have a portrait of him physically, but we have a portrait of his thoughts because that man liked to write. He wrote letters. He was writing to the Spanish, to the English, to Americans. He was writing left and right, and we have all of these different things that come together and can show you what he was thinking. Sometimes he has contradictory statements, and you realize he's writing to two very different people. He was somebody who could kind of live in both worlds. You might have caught on to the fact that his name sounds incredibly Scottish, and yet I am presenting him as a Native American. How is that possible? It's because his father was Scottish. His father was a Scottish trader named Lachlan McGillivray. But to understand the complexity of Alexander McGillivray, you have to know while his father was Scottish, his mother was Native American. And he was born in a town called Little Tallahassee in 1750. Now, this is an artist's depiction of a kind of stereotypical Muskogee or Creek town from around the time when Alexander McGillivray would have been born. So this is not from the time, but it's based on records of people who went to these towns and tried to orient it the same way. I always love to show it because I feel like it gives you a moment to understand what is important in each of these towns. You see, what we call the Creek Nation or the Creek Confederacy was a group of towns, 60 towns, that were politically independent from one another. What I mean for that, each town had their own town council. And that town council would meet in the center of the town square. They had their own ceremonial grounds. In fact, you couldn't be a town if you did not have that center section with a sacred fire. That was the symbol of the town. If you didn't have that sacred fire, if you didn't have that square ground, you were a hunting camp. You were a talufa, or like a little town. Think of it like a suburb of a bigger town. But you had to have that because it was the symbol of your identity. The town council is meeting here. Your ceremonies happen here. And the connection between each town was a kinship connection. There are families and large family groups called clans that expand these towns and connect them together. So while each town is independent, they have obligations, familial obligations to other individuals in the town. They have similar customs and ceremonies. They often speak the same language. So there's these connections with them, and there's an alliance of these towns. But for most of their history, they wouldn't have called themselves a nation. They wouldn't have worked as a nation. It would have been individual towns negotiating with other towns, maybe a collection of towns working together, right? But they wouldn't have said, we are a nation in that way. By the time you have a Mississippi going and talking to the British, the idea of a nation is something that has been kind of percolating throughout these towns. But people don't really agree on how they should be organized. Are the towns the most important political entity, or should they band together and make demands as a collective, right? How is the best way to approach this? Now, other things I'm going to quickly, and I would spend all day talking about this. If I had your patience and I had the time, I would sit here and tell you every single thing. But some things I want you to know also that are important about these towns. They have a collective cornfield. So they grow corn together. It's a communal field. It's the women who go into the field and do the farming. It was the sacred responsibility of women to do that because they believed that corn, the most important crop, was first originated in a woman. So in every single story of where does corn come from, it is the first woman. She is the corn mother who creates corn from her body, and then at some point after her death, it goes into the ground. And it is her daughters, it's her nieces, it's so on and so forth. They carry on that legacy by being the ones who cultivate it for future generations. So women are the agriculturalists. Men are farmers. Men are not farmers, hunters. Men go to war. Men are on the town council. They're doing things like constructing buildings and clearing fields, making canoes, things like that, right? And they have a very important part in the society, but it's important to know that about women because women have this important part in that system, in that economic system, so that kind of bleeds over into personal life. You see, women are also the head of their homes. The woman is the one who owns the home. So if at any moment the woman wants to divorce the man, she can. She just takes his stuff. She takes it out of her home. The green corn ceremony happens and divorce, right? But women also have a really important part within the family. They are matrilineal. And what that means is that the identity of a child depends on their mother. I told you about those clans, those big family groups. A child belongs to their mother's clan, all right? So let's say your mom is Deer Clan, your father's Bear Clan. You are Deer Clan. Let's say your mama's Wind Clan, your dad is a Scottish trader. You are Wind Clan. It doesn't matter who your father is. Your identity within this society is determined by who your mother is. So, in Little Tallahassee, they didn't care that his dad was Lachlan McGillivray. They cared that his mother was Sohoy, a member of the Wind Clan. And consistently, there's lots of stories about the origin of clans within the Creek or Muskogee world. And in every one of those stories, the Wind Clan is set aside as this very prominent, powerful, important clan. And Alexander McGillivray was a member of that clan. Wind people are across all of these towns. There's some smaller clans, maybe they're not in every town. Almost every town has representatives from the Wind Clan. Like I said, they have an obligation to you. So if you call on someone, they are your kin. They see themselves as your direct family. So even if they're in a town that you aren't from, even if they've never met you, they have an obligation to you. So this puts him in a very powerful family. And for the first 14 years of his life, he was brought up in Little Tallahassee. He was taught by his mother. He talks about a relationship with his uncle in a maternal family, a matrilineal family. Your uncle is very important in a young man's kind of rearing, teaching them what it means to be a man. So he's learning from them. And at the age of 14, his mother gave permission to his father to take him to South Carolina, and there's documentation that he had to get permission from the mom to take him. So he goes to South Carolina and learns from his dad. From his dad, he's learning kind of a classics education: Latin, Spanish, English, accounting, things like that. So Alexander McGillivray becomes this example of kind of we call it bicultural, we also might call him biracial, but what's more important is a bicultural upbringing. Because in his identity, he's not biracial, he's Native American, from his own perspective. But in his upbringing, he is learning about a Native American way of understanding things and a British way of understanding things. And that's what shows up constantly in his writing. He is blending the two together. He is making arguments that will help himself, his family, and he would argue the entirety of the Creek nation. He is increasingly putting to voice something that Mississauga introduced, this idea that there is a nation, and he's saying we should be a nation. We should negotiate all together because when each town works separately, that's how they will get the land. If they only need to have one town sign away land, that will eventually hurt all of us. So we should work together. Now, he undoubtedly knew a Mississauga. They're from the same town. But a Mississauga dies during the American Revolution. And that's really when Alexander McGillivray is coming of age. I told you it was important to remember George Washington's side because Alexander McGillivray chooses the other side. His father, Lachlan, was a loyalist. And so Alexander decided he really didn't want to fight his father. Out of support, he also becomes a loyalist as well. His father flees to Scotland, asks Alexander, "You want to come with me?" He says, "No, I'm staying here." And then the US takes his father's property, stuff like that. He never quite forgave the United States for that. He never really quite forgave them for chasing off his dad. But he's working with the British actively during the war. And so already you have people on kind of opposing sides of things. Now, what does he do after the war? He goes and talks to the Spanish. You see, we frequently forget that the Spanish were kind of secretly involved in the American Revolution, right? Helping and assisting the United States. And after the war, they get back Florida, right? So all of a sudden, after the war, you have the Spanish coming into Pensacola and Mobile. And Alexander McGillivray says he doesn't want to work with the United States. He says they have a disposition to usurp power whenever they're allowed to establish themselves. So he wants to work with the Spanish. And he goes to Pensacola and he works with Arturo O'Neill. And I'm sorry I couldn't find a better image of him. This is the only one I could find. And it is a horrible scan, but hopefully one day there'll be a better scan of this portrait of this man. And Esteban Miro. So we have the governor of West Florida and the governor of Louisiana, two Spanish gentlemen who are dealing with and not quite sure about McGillivray. We have all these letters back and forth. And again, this is how you can try to piece together what Alexander McGillivray was trying to do. And the thing is the Spanish needed them as a buffer between them and the United States. Because they weren't going to send a whole lot of Spanish people to these areas. And so they needed the help of the Creek Nation, and McGillivray offers that. We'll be a buffer. You trade with us, though. I don't want to trade with the United States. I don't want to deal with them. And so you have this, relationship growing here, and for a while it works out in both of their favors. Meanwhile, the United States, they have won the revolution, huzzah. They're now free. They have to figure out now how are they going to govern themselves. And for a while there, they were trying to define it with the Articles of Confederation, right? And it was a loose definition. They weren't sure how they wanted to handle the federal government and the state governments. So what do they do about Indian affairs? It's technically at the federal level, but there's absolutely no way for the federal government to enforce it. So you have, of a series over the next decade, states dealing with Native Americans. And in this area, you have it with Georgia. So Georgia, in this map, I'll explain in a second, it is a confusing map, but it's the best option for showing this. You have the state of Georgia making treaties with Muskogee or Creek towns to do a land cession in 1783 and 1785. The land cession in question is shown as number 7. So this map in general, it's a resource from the Bureau of American Ethnology. They have these maps, and it shows every land cession that was made by Native Americans. And every state has like 2 or 3 of them. And then it connects it, so the number then connects it to the treaty so that you can go through, but they can be really confusing. But I could not, for the life of me, find a map that just showed this land cession. So I said, this is the best I can get. So number 7, right there, and I'll highlight it for you. You can kind of, I just dropped that, I will grab that. But right here, that is the land cession that happened. So that land cession is incredibly important because it is the Oconee River Valley. And it was a land cession that they thought was important to grab, Georgia did, because they're wanting to expand. Soon after they made this deal, they made a whole big deal about, establishing a new town and a university in a place called Athens. And all of that is right there in the Oconee River Valley. And like I said, they talked to towns in that area. They made a negotiation with them. But you have McGillivray over on the other side saying, that's starting to come a little too close. Because if you give away that land, and you keep giving it away, you're going to get closer and closer and closer to Little Tallahassee. You're getting closer to the land that I live on. We should negotiate all together against them. And so he starts calling on all those people. Hey, Wind Clan members, fight with me. And they do. They go and fight in this area. It's something called the Oconee Wars. And they're fighting over this piece of land. And it goes on and on and on and on for the next about 8 years. And also in the next 8 years, you have people deciding, this Articles of Confederation isn't quite working out for us. We should make a constitution. We should make a new agreement. And who should be the very first president who works under this Constitution? And they elect George Washington. So, George Washington comes in, and now he's in charge. He sees all of this in front of him. He sees the Oconee Wars happening, and he has to figure out what is going to be the new policy of this new government. How are we going to move forward with this? And amazingly, he comes to a lot of the same conclusions that the British did, that he had rejected all those years ago. He gets his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. He says, look at what's happening with the Creeks. How expensive would a war be? How long would it take? Henry Knox does calculations. He says it'll take at least 2 years. It'll take $1.5 million per year. So that's $3 million at least that you're going to have to pay to fight the Creeks for the Oconee River. And that's just not feasible. They're in debt. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the support. They don't have the resources. He is facing the same issues that Great Britain had at the end of the 7 Years' War. And much like them, he has to figure out, well, then what's the policy going to be? At the same time, you have the state of Georgia, who is really annoyed that the federal government is saying that they are the ones who should be in charge of Indian affairs. Georgia thinks they were doing just fine. They didn't need the federal government to come in. So once again, you have this other question. You have state and federal tension, which would so define all of U.S. history, right? Here it is happening right there at the beginning. So he talks with Henry Knox, and he and Henry Knox, and you can follow along their letters as they formulate a new policy that will become the official policy of the federal government towards Native Americans. And it's a policy called the civilization policy. So this policy essentially looks and says, all right, we want land. We cannot take it by force. Both financially, it's not a great plan, but also it's not a great look. It's not very humanitarian to go in and fight people and kill them. So how can we do it in a, quote, more humanitarian way? And they thought, well, we can make an agreement with them, and in this agreement, we will promise to, teach them how to be civilized. Well, what does that mean? He's like, well, we're going to teach them agriculture. Remember what I told you? Agriculture's been around for centuries, but it wasn't the right kind of agriculture. It shouldn't be women farming, it should be men farming. They shouldn't be communal fields, they should be private fields. They should be making things and growing things for the market economy, not just for the town's consumption. Hunting, they want them to not have to be hunting anymore because hunting territory is what so much of that land is being used for. So instead of hunters, they should be ranchers. Hunting can be sometimes, but they won't need hunting because it won't be based on trading. So the deerskin trade is a huge part of the relationship between the colonists and Native Americans up until the Revolution. They want to end that. Let's stop that. They want them to not have individual towns. They want them to have instead a nation that's working, nation to nation. No more ceremonial grounds. They should be converting to Christianity. They should be living in brick houses. They should kind of get the sense of where it's going, right? And the belief was that quite literally, Native Americans would turn white. They would just be absorbed into American culture. They wouldn't need the land. The land would then, quote, open up. Problem solved. They wanted them to adopt racialized slavery, to become a part of the chattel slavery that is spreading across the South. They wanted it to expand into there, create that racial hierarchy. That was the purpose of the civilization policy. So they have this plan now. Now they need to have a place to write it out, to formalize it. Now I've given you a whole lot, and you're looking, when is she going to talk about that damn tree? I'm going to talk about the tree right now. The purpose of this whole talk wasn't necessarily about what's in the treaty. It was understanding what led to it. Because you have all this stuff happening. You have Alexander McGillivray who's fighting, and he has the Spanish who are backing him up, and the Spanish starts limiting the weapons that they're sending to him. They start saying, we're not going to support you. You have to kind of go out and you have to make a deal. So you have the U.S. coming up with a plan. You have McGillivray being pressured to go and make a deal with them. But McGillivray is also like, well, if you're going to cut off my trade, I'm going to go open up trade elsewhere. Because I don't play like that. You're messing with my stuff. So that's what's leading to them going to this treaty. And it's actually McGillivray. The name of this talk came from a quote from McGillivray. He's writing in May of 1790, right before he's about to head out and make the long journey from Little Tallahassee to New York City. He said, a treaty concluded on at New York, ratified with the signature of Washington and McGillivray, will be the bond of long peace and revered by Americans to a very distant period. Now that's not just him being maybe a little full of himself, right? He is seeing this is a momentous, this is it. We're going to make this deal, and they're going to talk about this deal for generations. And this will be a bond of long peace. So they go in together, and they make this treaty. And you can read the entirety of it. It's at the National Archives. We also have a reproduction of it at the Alabama Archives. Hey. And in this treaty, there are a lot of things that are said. Some of the most important is it actually enforces Creek sovereignty on Creek land. It says, here's the boundary, and they do confirm that land cession of the Oconee River Valley. It's like, fine, that is confirmed, but that's it. Now there'll be a boundary here. Within that boundary, Creek law is sovereign. And in this treaty, it even says if a U.S. citizen crosses over that boundary and commits a crime, the Creek are able to punish them. It says that that U.S. citizen forfeits any protections from the U.S. government. That's a pretty big kind of declaration right there. It also goes on to say we're going to leave this to in perpetuity. This will be your land. We'll set it aside. Promise. They do also outline, so this is where that plan that Henry Knox and George Washington were talking about, this is where it comes into actual fruition. They write it out in here and they agree on it. They're going to send a federal agent to live among the Creeks to teach them how to be civilized. And they list it out, providing them the domestic manufacturers of cotton production, not cotton production, that's not quite yet, but eventually it does become cotton production. Around like 1810, they start bringing cotton into Creek country. But in 1790, it's going to teach them how to grow certain crops and how to ranch and how to do things. They're going to supply them with all they'll need for that. There's also some secret articles. The secret articles give, McGillivray a rank of brigadier general. So he was looking out for himself too. He got himself a nice little salary from that. Another secret article was opening up that trade, because he didn't want the Spanish to know and get mad. So it was like, we'll open up a trade agreement between the Creeks. So now he has two avenues of trade, also benefiting him, but he would argue it also benefited everyone to have more avenues of trade. And it also allowed for Creek youths to be educated by the United States. So they were going to pay for Creek youths to be educated, certain ones. The very first person that got left with Secretary of War Henry Knox was McGillivray's own nephew, David Tate, showing that McGillivray is going to continue that cycle, be educated in this way, learn how to talk this way, learn how to be this way, but then come back home to help protect that, and that's what David Tate does. He learns, he goes off, he learns from Henry Knox, then comes back to bring that knowledge back home, to benefit the family, to benefit the nation in a way. So, this treaty, it is setting up all of this. It's telling us both how the Creek Nation is trying to work within this new dynamic. It's incredibly important because it's the first treaty that is negotiated under the new Constitution. So it's setting a precedent for how the federal government will work with Native American nations. It's providing a legitimacy to the federal government, right? Because the Creek Nation has been working with different people, working with the British, the Spanish. So by negotiating on an official capacity with the United States, they are also legitimizing the United States. Today, it's incredibly important as federally recognized tribes use these treaties as a way to trace back recognition, because there is a recognition of sovereignty. And they also have a way of showing the promises that were made and broken. So I told you, right, like this is this boundary. You are sovereign. This will be your land. 3 years later, Caleb Swan is walking through what is now Alabama and writing about it. He's writing about all the natural resources and the beauty in the land. And he writes, and this must, in the process of time, become a most delectable part of the United States, and may probably one day or other be the seat of manufactures and commerce. So even after the promise, there's already the understanding that eventually that promise will be broken. So this can show us that foundational part, that relationship, and how it's going to be defined, and how in the Southeast that relationship plays out. Thank you all so much for your time and your patience, and if you have any questions, just please let me know.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Colvin? Let me bring the microphone back because we want to be able to get the question on the recording we're doing. So I'll let you speak into the. Thank you, Sam. She got you.
Speak of all these treaties that the United States at the time made with these Native Americans, but me and my father were history buffs, and not too long ago we were watching a show on the History Channel, I think Great Courses, and it talked about how they made a lot of these treaties, but they didn't really uphold a lot of them. In fact, they failed to enforce them. Do you think that was their intention from the beginning to not enforce them, or did they just lose their way concerning that?
That's a hard yes and no. I think that there's always kind of like you would like to think that there is the intention you're going into a treaty with the best of intentions, but there's always with it this understanding, like I said, they were making this policy and this plan to have an outcome. Like it wasn't, they weren't hiding it in their letters. They were very clear about what they wanted. Henry Knox said, if we do this, it'll have the salutary effect of attaching them to the United States interests. And they wanted the land. And so I think it was always kind of a, best of intentions at the moment, but not going to go out of their way to enforce. When there are times when you have delegations of Native Americans going and asking them to enforce, and there's a push and pull. Sometimes some administrations did enforce the treaty. Sometimes they did actually undo. So most famously, the Treaty of Indian Springs, 1825, that was considered an illegal treaty. And I can get into that if you want, but I'm not going to give you a whole lot more on that. But it was considered illegal. So a delegation from Creek Nation goes to Washington. They actually undo that treaty. They consider that treaty null and void. The Treaty of Washington makes the Treaty of Indian Springs null and void, right? So it was kind of, they went, they asked, and it was kind of promised or enforced. But there's a lot of other times where they go to Washington and they ask them to enforce it, and they either say, well, we can't, maybe make a new treaty that gives away more land, or, we can't do that. Famously, you have Andrew Jackson saying, make me, like to the Supreme Court, right? Like he says it more eloquently, or it's like apocryphal, but essentially when the Supreme Court says, you have to do this, and he kind of is like, make me. And I don't want to say one way or the other because it depends on the administration, and it depends on who is there of what they were attempting to do and how they were willing to enforce it. But I would say that overall, in a very general sense, there was this expectation that this wouldn't be the last treaty. There was an expectation that there will be another one, that there will be future land cessions, that either formally a land cession or just gradually through the civilization policy, the land would just kind of become a part of the United States. And then you have, to me, one of the harshest moments after the Civil War. There's a law passed that says you're not independent nations anymore. We're not making treaties, we're going to make laws. So that completely changes the dynamic too, which is essentially what federal recognition was undoing, right? It's like we're no longer going to be dependent of you, we're going to try to be our own nation, right? So I never like to say that something's inevitable in history because everyone makes choices, everyone makes decisions, and everything that happens is a collective choice. But I do think that there was an understanding with every treaty that we might say it's the last treaty, we may say we promise, but there's definitely going to be another treaty. Yes?
Was this before or after? Since I read that you were talking about, I heard that you were talking about women's suffrage. Mm-hmm. Was this before or after that? And did the women's part and the growing the corn and all that, was it ritual or, was it something they had to do, like included with women's suffrage?
That's a great question. So, with women's suffrage, when you talk about the movement itself, it's usually later. But a lot of times when people talk about that issue of women's suffrage, they actually do start at this time, because at the founding of the nation and at the Constitution level, they have to start defining what they mean by citizen, right? And in the Constitution, they set it aside, well, states can decide. And so some states allow for women to have citizenship, most do not, meaning they are not allowed to vote. Famously, you have Abigail Adams saying, remember the women, and John Adams said, no. So you have this moment, right, where it's definitely an issue. It's something that people are conceptualizing at this time, But it's not until much later that you have like a formal movement. In 1848, we have a formal movement centering around this. And it's also coming in line with the abolition movement. So you have kind of abolitionists and suffragists at first working together. And so that's kind of when you start seeing it be formalized. As far as the role of Native American women within the society, what's so interesting is when you're looking at European sources about Native Americans, they frequently, there's that cultural misunderstanding. So when they see women in the field, they think, oh man, they're enslaved. Like we should free them. They don't want to be in the field. But from the Native American woman's perspective, it was actually very empowering. They had control of the field. And so you see this push and pull. That civilization policy I talked about, it's accepted to some degrees in some areas, it's rejected entirely in others, but one of the hardest things that they see is women giving up control of the agricultural fields because that's their place, it gives them power. And so you do see people kind of maybe looking at that, and people have talked about, the United States looking at Native American nations and seeing aspects of democracy or women and using that to come forward. So when suffragists are doing things later, they use a lot of imagery of Native American women in their arguments later. Yeah.
Do you think Lachlan McGillivray chose a woman from the Wynn clan to be associated with the most powerful?
I think yes. So when there could have been, I never want to say there couldn't be a love connection, right? You never know. Like maybe he just saw her and he was like, this is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, I love her. But usually when a European trader is marrying a Native woman, they're doing so for a very specific purpose. They need access to that town. They need a place in that town. They need a legitimacy, someone who can kind of be their in. Frequently, they're going to go into a town and find out who is the most powerful family in that town, and that family also wants to be connected to the trade, right? And so it is a economic relationship as much as it could be a love match. So I don't think it is a mistake that he ended up with someone from the Wynn clan, or just a happenstance. As far as I can tell, she was his only wife, which is actually not the case with some people. There are some people who had multiple Native American wives and a white wife and all these other mistresses and stuff like that. As far as I can tell, or in the research, she was his wife. So that might show some sort of emotional connection as well.
So what happened to McGillivray?
So he went back to Scotland. He actually outlived his son. So he was informed. So Alexander McGillivray dies in 1793, and Lachlan McGillivray is informed of his death at that time. And so Alexander McGillivray, so he comes back. He was always he felt like he was always kind of sick. You'll read a lot, I couldn't make this because I was sick for this and this and this purpose. He ended up getting a pretty serious case of gout. And he ended up dying 3 years after this negotiation. And he died in the presence of Spanish and British friends. He was away from home. He was traveling to meet with them, died there, and never made it back home. And so his sisters came and got his body and everything like that and did the rituals. But that was something that is always kind of sad.
One more question.
Yes.
Kate,
Mm-hmm.
who he left to be educated.
Yes.
He was his wife's sister's?
He was his sister's son. So David Tate is, in a matrilineal sense, his maternal nephew. So his sister's son is David Tate.
Okay.
Yes. I have a whole talk where I do have a genealogical talk. It gets crazy because the other crazy thing about Alexander McGillivray's family is there's 3 different Sahoys. Sahoy the first, Sahoy the second, and Sahoy the third. Sahoy the third is Alexander McGillivray's sister, and she is the mother of David Tate. Sahoy the second is their mama. So it can get really complicated, and there's a lot of people who are a part of that line who you may know. William Weatherford, he was also a maternal nephew of Alexander McGillivray. All Wynn clan. Yes.
How large of a delegation went to New York
That is a wonderful question. I'm all of a sudden now blanking on the exact number, but it was, I want to say it was like 35. I could double check that number. Not everyone ended up signing the document. Some people decided not to sign it, but there were like over 20 signatures on the treaty. They traveled by foot, by carriage, by boat, like all the way up. So they went, and they ended up having this really long journey up. So they went over to the coast in Georgia, then up, and then they came back in Virginia, and then they went up, and they kind of would loop back around. And they would make these stops, and it was almost like people were like, come see the Native Americans. And so every stop they'd make, they'd did this whole big thing, a party, a reception. So by the time they made it to New York, there was this like fervor of they're coming, they're coming. They make this procession down to the federal building, and that's where they're going to make their negotiation. They ended up staying, I'm blanking out now, it's like some wonderfully ironic name for the inn. I think it's like the Indian Queen Inn or something like that, which is just a wonderful irony. But except for Alexander McGillivray, he actually ends up staying with Henry Knox, which is another whole thing that causes controversy.
Wasn't there something about they changed their dress when they got there?
Yes, so think about when you're going to something, you're going to make sure you wear like, your best attire, things like that, right? So they might be traveling in a certain way, but when they show up, they're going to put on their best outfit. Probably what you're thinking about too was there are these famous sketches that are done of the delegates that come. John Trumbull was a portrait artist, and he actually did a portrait of George Washington. He so desperately wanted to do portraits of each of the people there, but they declined. They did not want their portrait done. He both, for the goodness of history, but maybe the ickiness of ethics, decided to ignore that and just did pencil sketches of them as they were sitting there waiting. So you can actually see these sketches of these native leaders that's there. That's the sketch that I talked about. That's actually Hobothele Miko, but everyone says it's Alexander McGillivray, but at the bottom, he writes his name. That's why I always get so confused. He was like, this is Hobothele Miko. Everyone's like, maybe Alexander McGillivray? No, different person. But those sketches are done, and you can see they're wearing like revolutionary-style jackets. So for those, because not everybody was a loyalist. Alexander McGillivray was a loyalist. Some people were on the side of the Patriots. And so if they were, they made sure to wear their blue patriotic jackets to this negotiation. They had medals and gorgets on. They had the best kind of dress that they could wear, and they are coming to kind of really show their power and influence. And so when they're kind of showing up and coming into that negotiation, they're going to wear their best attire. And Trumbull is able to draw those. And like I said, as a historian, I'm like, yes. But when you're like, oh, they technically said no, and you just ignored it, so that makes me a little like, political group that dressed. Oh, there was a party. I think that a party afterwards where they, and I can't remember the full details of it, but I think there was a party afterwards where they were given an outfit for that party. I think that's where Abigail Adams met them. But now I'm blanking on that. But I think I know what you're talking about with that one. I can't remember everything.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to say a special thank you to Dr. Colvin because it's always so refreshing to me to see somebody that knows their subject well enough that they don't have to have their notes. They've been in it, they've researched it, and it's just very, very wonderful to hear your presentation. Thank you so much for being a good friend of the Comer Library.
Thank you.
I do want to reiterate what Dr. Ted said. This is our last program in the series, and we will be back again in October with our next series. But I do want to say a couple of things before everybody dismisses. I want to thank again Mr. Chris Kramer in the back with First Bank of Alabama and Dr. Shirley Spears in the back with the Comer Library Foundation. Without these people working to help sponsor and without people working to help plan the programs, we would not be able to do what we do. So thank you both for the help that you do with all of this. I also want to say thank you so much to you for coming because you are what makes people like Dr. Colvin want to come to Sylacauga. When she says Sylacauga has a fantastic library, it's because when people come, they have an audience here. So thank you so much for being the heartbeat of what we do. One more thing I want to say is we don't ever recognize them, but I want to to today. We have a few library board members in the room. If they would stand up, Miss Janice over here, John Ham back there, Miss Becky Hackett in the back. I believe that's all we have here today, but I just want to point out this library is exactly as Dr. Colvin said. It is a fantastic library because we have fantastic leadership, and I want to thank you all so much for what you do for the library. Thank you again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you all in October.